Welcome to part 3, R-DF21 Revealed, a genetic chronicle of Ireland and Scotland. And this is part 3 of a series of talks in which I'll describe the DNA of the modern Irish and Scots. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Tyrone Bowe. I'm an experienced scientist. I first achieved an applied science diploma with distinction from chemistry in Dublin in Ireland, and then I acquired an honours degree first class in biotechnology from the University of West of Scotland. I did my Ph.D. in autoimmune neuropathies from Glasgow Caledonian University, and I was then a postdoc in Dundee, Scotland, and then a postdoc and senior scientist in the University of Galway, or National University of Galway, which is now University of Galway. I started Irish Origins in 2010, so I'm not affiliated with any DNA testing companies or universities. And this research is fully funded by myself, so no financial contributions from any other sources. And this is a professional service, and if you have any queries on your DNA or what tests to take, then just simply drop me an email, tyronebows@gmail.com, for a free consultation. So the story so far. So if you haven't watched these previous videos, I recommend that you do. Part 1 is a basic overview of what the Y-DNA studies reveal about the Irish and Scots. In part 2, I focused exclusively on the origin of the Gael. So when we think about Ireland and Scotland and Irish and Scottish identity, we think of the Gael, and their genetic story is detailed in part 2. And these talks are available on my YouTube channel. So part 1 described how I produced a Y-DNA map of Ireland and Scotland. And this is the Y-DNA map here. So the Y-DNA looks at the male lineage, okay? And what I discovered is that there's 15 dominant Y-DNA haplogroups combined into 11 trees that account for 99% of Irish and Scottish origins case studies that I've done over the last 14, 15 years. And this map is freely available to explore at www.originsmaps.com. So part 2 describes the origin of the Gael, which is the dominant DNA group of Ireland and Scotland. And I've highlighted the Gael, or the Gael Y-DNA signature, in these red boxes here in this image. So just to recap on the timeline of when all these markers arrive in Scotland and Ireland. So the earliest markers are from the Neolithic in around 4000 BC. Then in 2500 BC you have the Indo-Europeans arriving. And then there's a large gap before then the Romans arrive, and Roman DNA is detectable in Scotland. And then after that you have Vikings in around 800 AD. Now the group that we're going to look at today is R-DF21, which is highlighted in yellow here. So once again we're looking at the overall picture, and you see here in red are the Gaels, who I've described previously in part 2, and in yellow DF21, which is flashing down here in the corner. Now, just for context, as I mentioned, the Gaels are the most common markers, and they account for 21% of males with detectable Irish or Scottish ancestry. And the R-DF21 in comparison accounts for just 7%. Small but significant. So why do R-DF21? Well, basically because it's my story and I carry this R-DF21 mutation. So if you look at these haplogroup trees, this is the R-DF21 haplogroup tree. You see this little box here? Well, that's me. And that's my pinpointed origin down here, this little dot here in County Laois in the Irish Midlands. So each of these little blocks on this tree is a Y-DNA case study that I've done within the last 14, 15 years. Now, each case study has a specific SNP mutation, and it has a time point, and it has a pinpointed origin. So let's just step back and go right back to my original Y-DNA results. Now I have 110 genetic relatives at the 67 marker level, which is detailed here. And I share a common male ancestor with each of these males who appear in my DNA results. Now of those 110 genetic relatives, of those 110 genetic relatives at the 67 marker level, 51 have surnames like Bowe or Bowes or Carroll that recur among my matches. So these results are not random. So this just illustrates at the 67 marker level all my recurring surname matches: Bowes, Carroll, Dooley, Flanagan, Purcell, and Springer. And you can see their genetic distance, point at which they first appear as a match, and their frequency. So if I were to explain this in a sentence, basically the Bowe, Carroll, Dooley, Flanagan, Purcell surnames have arisen among related males living in a specific location within Ireland. These are all Irish surnames, or Irish associated surnames. Now, farmers in Ireland still concentrate in the area where their ancestors lived when surnames became common, or where one's ancestors first settled within Ireland. So, what I can do is, I can look at where all those farmers with those surnames that appear in my Y-DNA matches, where they are found in Ireland. And what you'll discover is that they're all associated. So my closest Y-DNA matches, surname matches, are all associated with County Laois and its borderlands in the Irish Midlands. So as I mentioned, this proves that the Bowe, Carroll, Dooley, Flanagan and Purcell surnames arose among related males living in the Irish Midlands. So my Bowe's paternal line originated in County Laois, where they and their genetic relatives have left evidence of their links with this area in its surnames, castles, place names, its history, and in the DNA of the locals. So if you look at the surnames of Laois, you can see my ancestors Bowe highlighted in a black arrow there, and they're surrounded by Y-DNA revealed surname matches like Flanagan, Dooley, Carroll, and Purcell. Now, if you look at the clan territories of Ireland map, which was reconstructed based on castle locations and their known historically associated clans and families, you see that this area was dominated by the Purcells and the O'Carrolls, who dominate among my Y-DNA matches. Now, so this is the Irish Midlands. This is Laois. There's the O'Carroll castles. There's the Purcell castles. And if you look in this area between those two set of castles, you see all these place names that were references to my Bowe ancestors or my paternal genetic relatives. And most interestingly is this one here, Bowe's Crossroads, here in County Laois. Now, so this area highlighted in red, this is my paternal ancestral genetic homeland. This is where my direct male ancestor lived when he first inherited his Bowe's surname approximately 1,000 years ago, and that's when paternally inherited surnames become common. So there you are, there's my Bowe's paternal ancestral genetic homeland. Now, if you look here, just up here to the right, you'll see Athy parish. And why do I mention Athy parish? Well, so this is my ancestral tree on ancestry.com, and this is my direct Bowe's paternal line, all the way back here to this earliest individual, and he is Dennis Bowes. And Dennis Bowes is recorded in Athy parish, which is what I showed you in the previous slide. And Athy parish is a mere 10 miles from Bowe's Crossroads. And this, and he's dated pre-1800 AD. So this research was done independently by Clan and my cousin Eddie Bowes. And that was only last year. So if we look at all this together, what we find is that my Bowe's Y-DNA and my paper trail from my Bowe's ancestors both lead back to County Laois. So as I mentioned, your ancestors will have left records of their association with their ancestral genetic homeland in the history of that location. And if you look at this, this was sent to me by Adrian Martin, who's a researcher here in Galway. And he sent me this poem about the O'Carrolls, who were that big landowning family in neighbouring County Offaly. And this describes their vassals. And if you look at it, so first it describes the O'Carrolls. So this is the O'Carrolls here. Carrolls get a mention. And it then describes your Flanagans and Higgins and Dooleys. Now, those O'Carrolls, Flanagans, Egan's, and Dooleys all appear among my Y-DNA matches, particularly the O'Carrolls, O'Flanagans, and Dooleys. Just to recap, you can see them there. So there was kinship among these people. Now, ideally, I'd see a reference to my Bowe ancestors somewhere in there, but no, unfortunately, there's not. Now, even more remarkably is that this area of County Laois was the first to be reconquered and colonised and settled in the mid-1500s. And you can see here, this is a map of Laois and Offaly. Now, it's turned on its side, so north is to the right and south is to the left. But what you can see is this gives you, this is quite remarkable. This is probably one of the first truly modern maps. And what you can see here, this is the area where my ancestors lived. That's very different then from what it is now. It's mainly farmland now. But back then, it was quite a wild borderland area of forests and bog and pasture. Now, another fascinating piece of information that was sent to me was from Adrian Martin, and he discovered these references to my Gaelic Irish ancestors. They're Gaels because they have the Bowe. And you can see that they're being recorded in Tipperary and Kilkenny, which are the areas of Norman control that border County Laois. So you see here, the areas in orange and yellow, that's the Norman areas, whereas the Gael areas on the clan map are in green. And my ancestors, these records of my ancestors are the guys who are living in the borderlands between the Gael and the Norman worlds. So very fascinating. So this is just a summary of what I've discovered in my DNA journey. And these are the things that you could possibly discover for yourself too. So I have a pinpointed origin within County Laois. It's dated between 800 and 1000 AD when surnames, paternally inherited surnames, first appear in Ireland. I found place names associated with my ancestors. I've linked my Y-DNA pinpointed origin with my paternal ancestral paper trail, which goes back to Athy Parish. I've discovered Gaelic Irish kinship with the Carrolls, the Dooleys, and the Flanagans. And I've discovered historical records of my medieval Gaelic Irish Bowe ancestors. But what else can be discovered? Now, this is where we delve deeper into the DNA. Okay, the DNA testing company also revealed my haplogroup, and there it is there, RZ16284. Now, I've done many case studies over the years, and these are my R-DF21 case studies. So here you go. For each of these customers, I have a pinpointed origin within Ireland or Scotland, and they all carry my DF21 haplogroup, or they all carry the same marker as me. And I can align all the data from these customers, and I compare them to myself and to each other. So this is my DNA results here. There's my RZ16284 terminal SNP, and that allows me to align all this data and compare all these individuals. So as I said, I can align all this SNP data from these R-DF21 case studies. And this is great. You can look at it like this on an Excel spreadsheet, but it's more interesting to construct a haplogroup tree. And this is the R-DF21 haplogroup tree. And there I am there, highlighted in red. Here we go, there I am there. And all these little blocks are other case study participants. And you can see how we branch off from each other. And the time frame, because these SNPs, all these SNPs can be dated. So we have a time frame, and I have pinpointed origins either within Scotland in blue or in Ireland, which is fantastic. Now, so that's me there in the red, but I'm just going to highlight one other customer of mine, and that's Patrick Duffy, probably one of my most famous customers. And there he is of Dallas fame, and there he is there. Turns out we share a common ancestor. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So Patrick and I share the RZ16249 mutation. And there's Patrick there. And if we walk back on my SNPs, my SNP mutations, this is the red line here, and we walk back on Patrick's on the orange line here, we can see that we meet at RZ16249. And that mutation can be dated. It's around 2000 BC. And that's when our shared paternal ancestor within Ireland lived. So what about ancient DNA samples? We can compare our shared SNP, see if it pops up in any ancient DNA samples within Ireland. So there's an ancient DNA database where you can look for R-DF21 ancient remain samples. And you can find that document or that Excel spreadsheet at this website here. Now what I can do, so you can see here that these are all remains that test positive for DF21, and it gives the locations from where these remains are found, and they date them, the remains as well. So you can see here that this is sample Y-DNA, and what's interesting is it tests positive for the same mutation, downstream of DF21, known as RZ16249, which myself and Patrick Duffy share. And this is my Vila Townland. And this is from our Heritage Data Maps website. You can see my Vila Townland, and you can actually see the area from which this set of remains were taken. And what's interesting is that it's there. It's literally less than 10 kilometers from where I currently live. And it's dated to 2100 BC. So Patrick and I, our shared ancestor, has been on this island based on these shared mutations since at least 2100 BC, which is pretty remarkable. So by comparing our DNA markers to ancient remains, Patrick and I, well, we match Y-DNA, which is dated 2100 BC, and that's, as I say, this is an Indo-European marker, so it's where ancestors have come in from the Bronze Age from Scotland, crossed into Ireland, and there are a couple of other ancient remains, not as old as Y-DNA from Rathlin and Noath and Rossnaree, and they share some similar markers to us, but Y-DNA is the closest to us, dates to around 2100 BC, and that means that their shared paternal ancestral line has been in Ireland for over 4,000 years. Pretty remarkable. So it's quite, you can determine how long your ancestral line has been in a location. using these ancient DNA remains. So, the R-DF21 Bronze Age Indo-European invaders who inhabited Ireland and Scotland from around 2500 BC until the emergence of the Gael in 200 AD. So that's the story of my DF21 ancestors. And if you think about it, between 2500 BC and 200 AD, that's a long time before the Gaels arrive and shape the modern identity of Ireland. And the story of my ancestors is one of, I like to call, splendid isolation on the fringe of Europe for over 2,000 years. But what do I call them? Well, I can't really call them Celts, because Celts are that's what you use to describe the inhabitants, the Indo-European distant cousins who inhabited or who evolved from the Indo-Europeans in Central Europe. Now, I can't really call them Irish because the Gaels don't arrive and shape modern Irish identity until around 200 AD. The story there is illustrated in the second of these talks. So that leaves ancient Britons. I can describe them as ancient Britons because basically this is what they were recorded as in the earliest references. So I'm calling them the ancient Britons, the DF21 inhabitants of pre-Gaelic Ireland. And so why am I calling them the ancient Britons? Well, the earliest references are from the Greeks, and they describe the Isles of the Britanni. And Britanni, by the time the Romans arrive, the P becomes replaced with a B and it becomes Britanni. So that's where we get Britain from. So we have the inhabitants of Great Britain and Ireland living in splendid isolation until the arrival of the Romans. And they refer to the inhabitants as the ancient Britons. Now, should this term be applied to Ireland? Well, yeah, because I'll show you in the next slide. So as I mentioned, we have a story of DF21 Bronze Age invaders, Indo-Europeans who dominate Ireland and Scotland from around 2500 BC until the emergence of the Gaels. And as I said, it's a story of splendid isolation, calling these guys ancient Britons. And the reason is because there is evidence of shared ancestry between the ancient Britons of Ireland and mainland Britain. Because if you look at this map here, this is the map describing the tribes in Britain and Ireland at the time of the Romans. And if we look at a couple of these tribes, you see you've got Brigantes in Britain, you got the Brigantes in Ireland. You got the Gigani in Ireland and Gigani in Wales. So there is evidence that there was shared ancestry between these isolated groups of Indo-Europeans. Now there are some studies out there, and they show this close shared ancestry between the the Irish and the British. And you can see here, this is a Nature paper. Now this paper looks at all your DNA markers from all over, people from all over Europe. And you can see here that this is the British Isles here, Scandinavia. So it's color coded here. And you can see how close the Irish and the British are. Now, there's more in-depth studies that look at Ireland and Britain in particular. You can see here, this is Ireland, so this is the DNA of the Irish. Here's the Scots here. You can see there's a lot of, this is probably the Ulster Scots merging in here. And then you have the borders, the Scottish and English borders, and then there's England, and then there's Wales. But you can see that our closest shared ancestry is with our nearest neighbour, Scotland. Okay, so it just illustrates that neighbours, close neighbours, you're going to have close shared ancestry. So the Indo-Europeans dominate the Y-DNA signature of Ireland and Scotland. Now, I've discussed the Indo-Europeans in part one of these talks, but I'll just give a brief overview. So, who were the Indo-Europeans? Now, this group here, the Yamnaya, are the group who we identify as the sort of ancestors of the Indo-Europeans, the earliest ancestors. So I found this image online. I don't speak German, but it illustrates beautifully everything you can associate with the Indo-Europeans, except perhaps cattle. Now, the Indo-Europeans, so their ancestors, or the Proto-Indo-Europeans, emerged from the steppes of Russian Ukraine in about 3,300 BC, and they are pastoralists. They are herding cattle, sheep, and possibly horses. They've domesticated horses and would eventually utilize the horses, horse riding, and chariots. And they've also mastered the wheel, and they will use wagons to basically expand their range, and they will go east into Iran and India, and then most importantly from this talk's point of view, they will expand west into Europe. And their expansion into Europe, well, they will bring warfare and disease, because this is really a sort of warrior culture. And as they expand into Europe, they bring war, they bring disease, and they basically lead to a 90% population replacement of the Neolithic inhabitants of Europe. And it is their markers, their Y-DNA markers, that dominate Europe to this day. And this is beautifully illustrated, this connection between East and West, which is the basis of this Indo-European expansion in tragically, the late Manco McGann's Brehons and Brahmins book, which I highly recommend. So let's get back to the story of R-DF21. So it all begins with the Indo-European expansions. The Indo-Europeans head east and west. They're broadening out with their herds and their warrior cultures. They get to the Central Europe in about 2800 BC. Some head north into Britain, 2500 BC, and into Ireland, again 2500 BC. And as I mentioned, this Indo-European arrival resulted in 90% population replacement of the Neolithic forced farmer inhabitants. And it's in Britain that R-DF21 first appears, and in case of Ireland, it's earliest it's detected probably 2100 BC. Now, meanwhile, in Europe, in continental Europe, the Celts emerge from the Indo-Europeans, and they're first described by the Greeks in about 500 BC, and the Gauls are described by the Romans about the same time. Now, so when we talk about Celts and Gauls, they're the distant cousins of the isolated ancient Britons. So if we look at the DNA map of Ireland and Scotland, what you find is that in Ireland we have a Gaelic north. Gaels dominate the north in the Y-DNA signature, whereas we have a Brittonic south. So the ancient Britons, their DNA signature dominates the south. And in the Highlands, in Scotland, you can see that the Brittonic Y-DNA signature dominates in the Scottish lowlands, and the Gaelic Y-DNA signature dominates in the Highlands, but also in the sort of highlands of the southwest, in the mountainous area of the southwest. So the story of the R-DF21 Indo-Europeans is one of isolation for approximately 2,700 years, until the emergence of the Gael, who are their Indo-European kin who emerged from southwest Scotland. So the Gaels emerged from this area here. And that the story of the Gaels is illustrated, is detailed in the second part of this series of talks. So we can summarize R-DF21. So it's an Indo-European marker. Now, it probably first appeared in Britain before it's taken into Scotland and then Ireland. In Ireland, the earliest R-DF21 ancient remains date to 2100 BC. And in total, I found that 7% of Irish and Scottish origins Y-DNA case studies will test positive for R-DF21. So that means that 7% of males with Irish or Scottish ancestry worldwide will carry this R-DF21 marker. Now, it's just one of several Y-DNA markers of the pre-Gaelic Indo-European ancient Britain inhabitants of Scotland and Ireland. And I'll detail the rest of those markers in time in additional talks. Now, the ancient Britons would come to dominate Britain and Ireland until the emergence of Rome, and in the context of Scotland and Ireland until the emergence of the Gael in around the 2nd century AD. Now, today, R-DF21 is prevalent in the central belt area of Scotland, and in Ireland it's prevalent within Leinster and Connacht. Leinster in the southeast and Connacht is in the west. So it just remains for me to thank you for bearing with me and listening to my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like and subscribe and share this talk. If you want to get in contact with me, you can do so either via the Irish Origins or Scottish Origins websites. There are also blog posts on these websites, links to other videos. The maps which I've detailed in this talk, they're all free to browse online. There's digital copies which you can browse online, and you can also browse the haplogroup trees freely online at originsmaps.com. But if you decide that you want to purchase some of those maps, we've recently installed a Shopify page where you can go and either buy the Irish or Scottish themed maps or the haplogroup trees. So, and if you want to get in contact with me, if you have some DNA results you want me to take a look at, I never charge for examining results because I can't work with everyone's results. So drop me an email at tyronebowes@gmail.com. And thank you once again for your time.